I think so.
It hurts.
Yep.
It's going to get worse.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to have Paul Moore to lead us in a song this morning. We need to warm up this morning. So Paul's going to warm us up with a song as we get started in class. Our class comes from a book called Overcoming Apathy. I reduced that to 3 lessons. We're doing 3 lessons on apathy, overcoming apathy, spiritual apathy in particular, in the month of January. Next Sunday, we're going to have a guest speaker here from Mississippi, editor of the Magnolia Messenger, Dennis Dowdy. He's going to be here, and he'll have class time. So we're just doing 3 classes on apathy before we start a new study in February. We don't have a book to follow, but I did prepare these handouts. They are at Levy Central, and they at least tell the topic of the day. Today we're going to talk about the causes of apathy. But we're going to get our minds and hearts and voices going as we sing a hymn together. So Paul, if you'll come lead us in that hymn, please.
Let's sing first and the third. The first and the third. Take time to be holy, speak often thy Lord. Abide in him always, and feed on his word. Make friends of God's children, help those who are weak, forgetting in nothing his blessing to see. Take time to be holy, be strong in my soul. Each thought and each motive beneath his control. Thus led by his Spirit to fountains above, thou soon shalt be fitted for service above.
Thank you, Paul. My wife Patty is coming in the door. First thing I want to do is issue an apology to her because I picked up her phone as well as mine this morning. So, yep. So that one's yours. I do have my glasses, and by the way, last week, you know how I couldn't find my glasses, and I looked here, and I looked, hanging here, and these pockets here, and I asked you if you saw them hanging anywhere. Later in the day, I found them right here. So I do have them today, and they're same place I had them last week, but this week I know where they are. A couple of things then. One is, I want to welcome those who are visiting this morning. We have a couple of faces we don't normally see in class. We have Brother Ernest back here. Johnson, right? Jones. Brother Ernest Jones is here. He's visited before, but Ernest is here today. And then, Patty, you want to pay attention to this. Sitting up front, Mary Ann McComber. Her husband is Larry McComber. Larry and Mary Ann uh, served the church in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So her husband is the preacher in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is where my dad preached when I was in all of my teenage years. And so Mary Ann and I, she currently lives in the house that I lived in because it's a parsonage situation. So the McCombers live in the house that I lived in way back when I was dating Patty. So we have those visitors. I think everybody else is a familiar face this morning. Last week, as we condensed for this class group the book that's titled Overcoming Apathy by Uche Anizor, we covered two of his chapters, or at least I had it in my note to cover two of his chapters. I mostly covered one and didn't quite get to the second one much. But he begins by speaking of how there is in our world, in current times and in this current place, there is a culture of apathy. And that is just the idea, to put it in simple terms, it's cool to not care about anything. You know, we're a whatever kind of society, so it's cool to not care, even about meaningful things. And there's a lot in our culture that feeds into that. We talked about those things last week. We spoke of the concept of apathy, in which Anizor gave his definition of apathy. So a couple of things to remember about that as we get into our lesson this week. I want to remind you about a couple of things about apathy. Apathy, which is non-caring, just not able to rev up any zeal or passion about meaningful things. That's the problem. Apathy generally is selective. Anizor talks about how depression is a cousin to apathy, but a difference between depression and apathy is if you're depressed, you're pretty much depressed about everything. Apathy, though, can be very selective. You might have several things going on in one area of your life, but there are some other areas, oftentimes meaningful areas, areas in which we really should care about, where we just can't find passion and zeal for those things, even though we know that we should care about those things. So then we not only find ourselves not caring about that, but we know that we should care about that, yet we can't, and we might even know some things we could do to kind of jumpstart ourselves to care about that, but we can't get ourselves moved to do those things that would jumpstart us to care about that. So apathy works in that kind of way. And when it hits our spirituality, then we can find that we are apathetic when it's a spiritual thing about the most important thing, eternal things. Look in your Bibles at Romans chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2. Romans 10, verses 1 and 2, where Paul said about the Jewish people, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge." So Paul said the Jewish people had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. They had not heard, or in some cases, if they had heard, they had not received and absorbed in their hearts the gospel message. So they didn't have a correct knowledge of God. At one time, the Apostle Paul could have put himself in that very category. He had a zeal for God, and that's why he said he persecuted Christians. He persecuted the church because he thought he was doing God a favor by doing that. He thought he didn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah, and he thought that Christianity then was misleading people. So he persecuted, leaving behind the Jewish ways he was so fond of and knowledgeable about. So he persecuted Christians, and he did that out of a zeal for God. That's why he said at one time, the things I did in good conscience. I was doing it out of a zeal for God. It's just that I was not knowledgeable. I didn't know and I didn't understand. And finally, when I heard the gospel and received the gospel and began to learn the things of Jesus Christ, then of course his life changed and his actions changed, and he became a minister and preacher, evangelist, missionary of the gospel, rather than a persecutor of Christians. So he would put himself in that category at one time in his life where he had zeal but not knowledge. Here's the problem about apathy. In apathy, oftentimes we have the knowledge. We know, we've heard, we've understood. At times in our lives, we have embraced the gospel and embraced Jesus and been excited about that. And we're thrilled to be a part of that and doing the things of Jesus. So we know, but now somehow the zeal is gone and the passion is gone. So how do we overcome apathy? That's what this book is about. It's overcoming apathy, replacing apathy then with zeal and passion. Last week, one of the verses we talked about was the Revelation passage in the letter to the church at Ephesus about they had lost their zeal for their first love. And that can happen, as it happened to the church in Ephesus. It can happen to many of us. When it happens to us individually, that's a problem. When it happens to too many of us individually, then that becomes a whole church problem. A church can lose its passion and just start to go through the motions. So we want to be a people who overcome apathy. And here is the definition from that Anazor had. This is how we ended class last week. Apathy is a psychological and spiritual sickness in which we experience a prolonged dampening of motivation, effort, and emotion, as well as a resistance to the things that would bring flourishing in ourselves and others. It's a sin that expresses itself as restlessness, aimlessness, laziness, and joylessness toward the things of God. When mentioned next week, we're going to have a guest speaker. Then Sunday after that will be the final lesson, and we're going to talk about the cure for apathy. So we've had the culture of apathy, the concept of apathy. Coming up, we'll talk about the cure of apathy. But today, we're going to do the causes of apathy. So we're not getting to the cure yet, but we are going to talk about the causes. And again, on the handout that's available at Levy Central, I have these listed. Anazor presents them as like the 7 deadly sins. He presents the 7 deadly causes of apathy. And they are doubt, grief, triviality, feelings of inadequacy, lack of discipline, fragility, and lack of purpose. So we're going to talk about those 7 things this morning. Because, we preachers like alliteration so much. And so that's why he organized his book around words that begin with the letter C. So we've got the culture of apathy, the concept of apathy, today the causes of apathy, and next time we do this class, the cure for apathy. But when you actually begin reading the chapter, besides over the causes of apathy, Anazor prefers the term backstory, that apathy, when we are experiencing apathy, it may not be so much as a cause as just a backstory. There's a latent thing in our lives, that something that is behind that is behind the manifestation of apathy. And so we'll talk about backstories or causes this morning. And the first one that Anazor mentions is doubt. Now, I would suppose that every Christian at one time or another has crossing through their mind, is this really real? Is this really right? Especially when our culture bombards us from its humanistic standpoint rather than a godly standpoint. And so there's a lot of questioning of the existence of God and of the movement of God and the work of God in the world. And sometimes we might then find ourselves with a question or two that we might associate with doubt. Actually, doubt can be a good thing and a healthy thing, because what doubt does is it questions things. And so when we begin to question things like the existence of God or the reliability of the Bible, then we can look into those things and we can find that there is all sorts of evidence on various kinds of levels for God and for the Bible, his existence, the reliability of the Word. And so it's good to look into those things. If we question, we look into them, and then we find affirmation. So those things can be good. Doubt can be good in that way. But when doubt gets too deep within our minds and hearts and spirits and goes unaddressed, then doubt can lead to paralysis. That's a lot of what apathy does. Apathy just causes us to, since we're not caring, then we're also not doing. So we are suspending our actions in the spiritual arena. We find ourselves paralyzed when it comes to Christian things. There are three categories of doubt that Anazor mentions. One is what he calls factual or philosophical, and that does have to do with the existence of God, the problem of evil. That is a big discussion these days. He also says there is an emotional sort of doubt, and that is we ask the why questions. We just can't get over the why questions, the what if questions, and we find ourselves passionateless about the existence of God. And does it really matter? And it gets into our emotions. And then what he calls volitional doubt, which is eventually it may not be where volitional has to do with making a decision. And so it may not be that we decide one day, well, I'm just not going to care anymore. But we have found ourselves so resistant and so far retreating from even the discussion, those things that matter, God and the Bible and hope, those things that really matter, we find ourselves, I don't even want to talk about that. And so we retreat from the discussion. So regarding doubt, Anazor points us to Psalm 73. So let's turn to Psalm 73. In looking at this psalm this week, I found this psalm quite informative as it relates to people who are undergoing an apathetic period in their lives. So here are some things to note about Psalm 73. You know what we said about the problem is not knowledge, it's zeal. The Jewish people had a zeal not according to knowledge. We have the knowledge, we're just not zealous about it. So Psalm 73 begins with an affirmation. The psalmist says, here's something that I know. Psalm 73, and the first several words there are, truly, God is good to Israel. So the psalmist knows, he's aware of that. He knows God. He knows the goodness of God. He knows that God is active in his people. And yet, even though he knows that, listen to verse 2. And this really describes apathy that's coming from a doubt, a backstory of doubt. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. And that's the way that we feel sometimes in our spirituality. Yes, we know that God is there, that God is good, that God is active, but our feet are just slow. We're stumbling. We're not keeping up, and we can't find the motivation to raise our hands and lift our knees and get things going. And here is what this psalmist says was a backstory to his doubt. Verse 3 says, "For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." This is a doubt that question of doubt that comes up not only in that world, but in our world. You know, in the song that's often sung in the churches, farther along, we'll know all about it. You know, but it starts out, you know, why is it that the wicked are prospering and the good seem to be struggling? And why does that go on and on that way? And that was what that psalmist saw in his world, that the wicked were prospering, those who were attempting to follow the ways of purity and goodness were languishing, and mostly his focus became on the wicked and how things seem to be going swell in their life. Notice verse 4, they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek. They're not in trouble as others are. They're not stricken like the rest of mankind. Pride is their necklace. Violence covers them as a garment. And he goes on and on about, so he can't get his eyes off of the wicked and how some of them are doing, while those who are good seem to be languishing. And then here's the effect that it has on him. You know that those of you that are regulars in class know that I usually use the ESV, the English Standard Version. Here's the way verse 10 reads in the English Standard Version. Therefore, his people turn back to them and find no fault in them. And then there is a footnote. And I found that verse, as it's written there, didn't speak to me. I couldn't quite figure out what was being said there, but the footnote really does. So you might have a different translation that already says this, but if not, maybe in your footnote. But here's what my footnote says about verse 10. It says, here's the probable reading. I don't know why they didn't put the probable reading in the reading. But anyway, they said, here's the probable reading. The waters of a full cup are drained by them. So instead of people turn their back and find no fault in them, the footnote is the waters of a full cup are drained by them. And those words do paint a picture of apathy. Apathy is a draining thing. We've already mentioned a little bit ago when I read Anazor's definition of apathy. He spoke of the word motivation. It's a lack of motivation. So we just feel concerning things that we should feel excited and energetic about. Instead, we find ourselves maybe with a backstory of doubt. We become zeroed in on some thing that brings up questions about God, and we can't get our eyes off of that thing, and it just drains us, and it zaps our motivation. And so that's how this psalmist says that he's feeling. He's like water in a cup, but the water is leaking. The water is draining, and that's how he feels. But then, down in verse 16, because after all, this class is about overcoming apathy. Down in verse 16, the psalmist begins to address, after he'd gone through that apathetic time, about how he got back to his zealousness of God. Verse 16 says, but when I thought how to understand this, first of all, it seemed to me a wearisome task. He didn't even, you know how we said about apathy, not only do we not care, but we can't make ourselves care about not caring. And so when he first started the path to overcoming apathy, it seemed a wearisome task. But then he says this, verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God. You know, our assemblies really are important for a lot of reasons. Our assemblies are important because God calls us as a community to come together and to worship him. And as we together offer our voices of praise, and as together we add our prayers together, and as together we open the Word and study it, and then go out and live that together, that really ties us together as a community. So there is so we are giving to God in worship and in service. But you and I also know that we get something out of being here. There is an encouragement that comes to us. There is an uplift. And no doubt, we've all found ourselves in this situation. Sunday morning comes. I don't really feel like going to church today. And it's not because it's cold. I just don't really want to go. And what happens with a lot of people is then they don't go. And so the next Sunday they don't go either. And the next Sunday they don't go either. And then it becomes a habit to not attend. And their spirituality is draining like that water in the leaky cup. But we also have had this experience. I don't really feel like going today. But fortunately, I have a really great habit of being where I need to be at 9 and 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So, out of habit, I'll go. And then we go, and then we find such a blessing. And we find such encouragement. And we go away and we say, man, I'm really glad I came today. I'm glad I saw this person. I'm glad I heard that lesson. And so that's the way that, and it can seem, come Sunday morning, it can seem like a wearisome task, but when we get to the sanctuary, then we find the blessing, we find the encouragement, and we go away motivated, and the backstory of our doubts, maybe we don't even get our doubt answered. Like, why do the wicked prosper for so long? We may not even get that answered, but at least we get our eyes off of it. We're not zeroed in on that and so focused that it's killing off motivation and everything else. And so, down in verse 23, the psalmist says, nevertheless, regarding being with God and God being with him, nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, you will receive me into glory. There is the motivation. There is the guidance in this life, the blessing that comes in this life, but there also is the hope of glory that lies before us. We are spending a lot of time on this first of the 7, so we won't spend so much time on some of the others. But the very last backstory of doubt, number 7, is lack of purpose. When we don't have a purpose to glorify God in our lives, then that becomes a backstory for doubt. And these all go together. This feeds into that. And so this person has the hope of glory, recognize because he's come to the sanctuary and been with the people and been in worship and been with God. That refires his energy. Ernest, you going to say something back there? Mm-hmm. Yeah. They are zealous about their wickedness. Yeah. Mm. It does, yep. And sometimes with that, sun shines on the just and the unjust. And if we are so focused on how the sun is shining on the unjust, we might forget the sun is shining on us too. So, although sometimes it rains, maybe raining on us too. But that's the way that works. So here is this psalm, and I really enjoyed this week taking a look at this psalm and seeing what there is a line here, verse 21. He's talking about when he was apathetic, when he was going through that apathetic period. He said, here's how I felt. When my soul was embittered, when I was pricked in heart. So he's out on spiritual things. As a matter of fact, he finds his soul embittered. And when someone tries to say something to him, when someone or something pricks his heart to try to do something different, here's how he said I reacted to that. I was brutish and ignorant, and I was like a beast towards you. I just sold up, and I got stuck in my apathy and wouldn't move. So the psalmist felt that way. But in the end, having been to the sanctuary, in verse 25, here he asks some other questions. His question used to be, well, why are the wicked prospering? But in verse 25, he has a new question. And the new question is this: whom have I in heaven but you? And so he sees then the goodness of God and the blessing of God. So he ends this way in verse 28. Here's his overcoming. But for me, it is good to be near God. I want to remind you, back in verse 2, when he was in the apathy situation, he said, but as for me, my feet were stumbling and my steps were slipping. But now when he gets to the end, in verse 28, now for me, but for me, it's good to be near God. So we spent some time with this so that we would address these doubt situations, but also to help us see that others experience the things we're going to talk about this morning. Other people experience them, but they not only experience them, sometimes they experience them to great depths and still are able to overcome. The second backstory or cause, Ernest? Yep. Mm-hmm. And this person decided, and it's good for me to be near to God in that way. Grief. You know, there are the famous stages to grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And what can happen in any stage of grief, whether we're in denial about what has happened, whether we're angry, we've accepted the reality of what happened, but now we're angry about it, or whether we're in the bargaining, we're trying to fix things, and then depression comes, finally some acceptance. But in those first, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, we can get stuck on any one of those. We might move past denial but get into anger and can't get past the anger. We might get over being angry, but then find ourselves depressed and we can't get over the depression. So all of those things, all of those stages of grief, we can get stuck. And so there is this phrase, this is what counselors tell us: we have to work through the stages of grief. You have to work through the stages of grief. So overcoming apathy, and sometimes with a backstory of grief, we can see how suffering a loss can just knock us off of our game and zap our energy and our zeal. Maybe it even brings in some questions that brings up the doubt thing, and now we've lost motivation and we've lost energy and we're not serving God as we should. And so we do have to work through those stages of grief, work through the grief, because grief can be paralyzing to us. What grief does when there's a loss, then in the loss we can get stuck on the loss, on what was past, on what we once had, on who we once had. We can get stuck and our lives are just suspended for a while. We can't move on from the focus on the loss. But there also is a new future, and we get stuck sometimes between the loss and the future, and we're just nowhere with that, and that can happen in the backstory of grief. Another backstory or cause of apathy these days, in particular in the world in which we live, the place in which we live, is triviality, which is losing touch with the meaningful. I know, I think from my experience, our vocabulary has moved on past this. Maybe there are some new words. But y'all remember how maybe a decade, 20 years ago, everyone seemed to use the word awesome in every other sentence. Everything was awesome. Well, that's awesome. What happened is awesome. And I do think it kind of struck us at one time. We sort of kept that word awesome to talk about really awesome things. Our God is an awesome God. But we started talking about all of these things that were awesome. This is awesome. Somebody mentions, that's awesome. And what happens when we assign awesomeness to everything, including trivial things, then nothing becomes meaningful and everything becomes trivial if everything's on the equal basis of awesomeness. So the overuse of the word and vocabulary, but it can, even if we don't have the vocabulary, that can happen in our lives. We get caught up on in the trivial, and because we're stuck in the trivial, we're not dealing with the meaningful, and sometimes we even begin to think that the trivial itself is meaningful. And so we might get caught up. So there's, in Hollywood, then we get caught up in the lives of the Hollywood people, and somehow that becomes important. And, it's in the news, and you can watch 30 minutes about that on Entertainment Tonight every night, that sort of thing. So we get caught up in the trivial and lose touch with the meaningful. And so triviality, which is a part of our culture, can feed into apathy as well, because God is not trivial. God is awesome, but we can lose touch and lose meaning with that as we deal with other meaning, with trivial things. Then the number 4 backstory is feelings of inadequacy. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this one, not quite as long as we did with doubt, but a little bit more on this one. Because people in our world are insecure. A great many people really have a lack of confidence in various areas of their life. And sometimes that insecurity and that lack of confidence finds itself regarding our spiritual things and our relationship with God and how we're doing with God. And the feeling of inadequacy feeds into that as a backstory to that, because when something seems so large to us that it is overwhelming, then our response can be, well, why bother? There's a great big world out there that needs evangelizing. Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And we might just say, well, the world's a big place, and people don't seem to be very receptive of the gospel anyway. Why bother? My neighbors don't want to hear it. Nobody wants to talk about that. And so why bother with that? Homelessness is a huge problem. And sometimes that can seem so big. Well, here we do a lot of things at Levy Church regarding the homeless, including we have bags people can put in their car to give people. We currently have people that are staying in the Bob. We're using the Bob as a transitional housing. And we have people that will be going out in vans to help people get to community centers. There's a lot of stuff that happens here. But sometimes when we see the hugeness and bigness of the homeless problem, well, who's going to defeat that? How can we, so why bother? And we end up, because we feel overwhelmed and it's too big of a problem for me to do by myself, then we don't do those things at all. I want to tell you all, by the way, in connection with that. And if you're on our Facebook page, there's been a kind of an ad that has gone out. It's a teaser ad, but we are going to have, coming up in April, we're going to have, we're calling it a community cookout. It's been some years ago, in fact, before my time. I've been here 5+ years. It's been before my time that we were doing community days. And so we're starting to bring some of that back. It'll be like Community Day because it's new and different and a restart. Not quite the scale of the great big Community Day, but we're going to call it Community Cookout. We're going to do those things, and that'll be on Saturday, April 20. And we are putting the word out now because it will take a great many volunteers in order to pull that off. The next day, April 21st, will be Friend Day, which feeds into evangelism. So we're working towards the community impact and evangelism, some of those big things, and we are working towards those. If we were to feel inadequate about that, then we wouldn't even try, and we wouldn't care, and we wouldn't think about it. But we are coming towards those things. Look at the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In 1 Corinthians 15, here's Paul. And Paul, by the way, is the greatest missionary that God has ever sent, that the church has ever known. But here's how Paul felt about himself as he started off on the journey of being a missionary and being an apostle for the Lord. So this is 1 Corinthians 15, and listen beginning at verse 9. Listen for the vocabulary of inadequacy. For I'm the least of the apostles. I'm unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. So we see how Paul feels small in those ways. But then again, verse 10, there is a but. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. So whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. So Paul mentions his feelings of inadequacy, of unworthiness, of this big task that is before him, but he also recognizes the grace of God and that God wants to use him. And so his solution is to work hard. I'm going to work harder than any of them. And he was a hard worker. And then he found himself, here's I, this is the last verse, here's I, here's they, the other apostles, the other evangelists, here's the people who believe. Suddenly, it's not just me against the wickedness of the world, but it's a set of us. It's I and they and all the believers that have come. So those things get overcome. Quickly, let's do the last ones. Lack of discipline. If we're going to be hard workers for the Lord, then we're going to have to put some discipline into being a hard worker rather than being lazy. Here's something I've noticed. Bring up the phone again. Sunday mornings at 10 minutes after 10, which is just about getting to be Lord's Supper time, I get a little buzz on my phone. I don't remember setting it myself, and I don't know how to turn it off, so it just happened. But at 10 minutes after 10, every Sunday, I get a report that tells me how much screen time I averaged each day that week. And oftentimes it's embarrassing to look and see that I spent that much time on my phone on average that week. And it's so easy to get caught up in that sort of thing. So if we're going to change things, improve things, get involved in more meaningful things, it's going to take some discipline in order to do that. One of the backstories is fragility. And this one, if we had time to talk about it, I would just sound like an old person because this is about how young people today, they're just fragile. They've been so protected. They're just not resilient. And Anazor talks about how there is fragility where people have been so protected, they can't heal themselves when they do get hurt. And then he says there is robust, and that's when people get hurt, but they can handle it and move on. But then there are the anti-fragile who take the difficulty that's come, and they use it to become better. Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 4 says that we should rejoice in our suffering because suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And so let's move past fragility. And then there is that lack of purpose that we talked about. Ecclesiastes is all about how life seems vain, useless, empty, until you get to the end, which is, I figured it out. And what I figured out is our purpose is to fear God and keep his commandments. This gives life meaning and gives the world meaning. And then we want to note that we are working in a battle against the flesh, that work harder thing, but also the spirit. We need to work on those things. I want to give a reading. This is a little summary that mentions all of these things together. So what is your story? We talked about the backstory. What is your story? Is it doubt, grief, or the feeling that you've been suffocated by triviality? Does your story include feelings of inadequacy, a lack of discipline, fragility, or a diminishing sense of purpose? Our apathy is likely to involve a combination of these and other backstories, and one person's set of causes will differ from another. And yet we battle that in our flesh, and we battle that in our spirit, and we battle it by the grace of God, who helps us to overcome our backstories, our inadequacies, these things that would cause carelessness, where we build a real zeal for God as we share together in serving him. By the way, I think it will get mentioned, but while I'm here, there will not be a 5 o'clock in here service tonight, no 5 o'clock service. Like the Tuesday men's class, we're not going to have the Tuesday 6:30 in the morning. It's going to be bad then. The 2 o'clock class that I do on Wednesday, the whole purpose of that class is not to be out when it's bad. And it may be better, but it's still going to be bad. So at least those things that I'm involved in, we won't be doing this week. I haven't turned it off yet. My hands are full.